So in this video, I'm going to be reviewing my first CO2 laser. This is the Omtech Polar Plus. It's a 55 watt CO2 laser. It actually had to be shipped freight. These lasers I'm reviewing keep getting bigger and bigger, which is why I stopped doing giveaways. I just can't afford to ship lasers freight like that. But with that also said, I had to upgrade my tabletop where I'm going to be storing this because the footprint of this is quite large. Luckily, I had this kind of backup butcher block slab, which someone gave me years ago, which I could pop on the top. I still have the WeCreate laser, and then I could put the Polar next to it. And this is about 104 pounds, so it is pretty heavy, but I somewhat regularly lift my planer in the shop, which is about 90. It's quite similar. I consider these enclosed units to be pretty close to plug and play units. Pretty much take them out of the box, you take some padding out of them, they're just about ready to go. This is the crate that it was shipped in. You could see it was quite large, very well packaged. It came with a bunch of extra stuff as well. A rotary setup, which I'll show a little bit later. It also came with all of the equipment to vent this outside. These enclosed units are really nice because venting these is pretty much a necessity, especially these high-powered units which produce a lot of heat. I already had this set up for the WeCreate, but they gave me a really powerful suction fan as well to put in line from that vent. Since I've had all of this set up, I've had no issues with smoke or smells in the shop. This is also such a powerful unit. They recommend plugging this into its own surge protector, and if you're using power cords, they have a rated joule rating for those power cords. Just make sure you do that as well. Has a camera, which I always point out because I like them. And I'm specifically pointing out how this auto focuses and how much space is underneath the head of this laser, because that will come into play later in the video. This is somewhat important and was a game changer for this laser. So the autofocus is nice. The camera is one of those add-ons that I really like. I always emphasize that if you're going to bite the bullet and purchase one of these, you really need to decide what you're going to be using it for and what add-ons you want. That will really determine what kind of laser you need to get. Not everyone is going to need a unit like this, especially if you're just a hobbyist. So like all these reviews, the first thing I do is I go around and I do my logo. They also had a free file in the computer, which I tried out first. The point of doing this logo, and you could see how many of those I've done in the past, stuff like this is where the camera really shines because you can utilize all of that space to set up your files much easier than before the cameras came around and you were flying blind a little bit. This is going to track how long it takes to process on the computer pad there. But like I said, why I like to do this is, especially the units you had to construct yourself, it's going to very quickly tell you if everything is aligned, it's cutting properly. I don't spend a lot of time dialing in the settings for that first project. It's mostly just to see that it plugs in, it works with light burn and all of that. So then quite quickly, it was my niece's birthday. So for like $2, I got this file off of Etsy. I get a lot of files off of Etsy because I haven't taught myself how to draw SVG files, which is what these are going to cut. So it's just easier for stuff like this to spend a couple bucks on an Etsy file, just import it right into Lightburn and it will cut for you. Now the version of Lightburn I had to upgrade. I had a paid version. I had to upgrade it in order to use the CO2 file. So that is another thing to consider as well. On top of the paid version of Lightburn I think it was another $100 to make it compatible with this laser. Now this is cutting 3mm ply right now, and I'm once again, this is upside down, but I'm once again pointing out that this is almost a pen's thickness away from the wood. One of the biggest problems I've had with testing all of these lasers is because I'm mostly cutting wood with these, especially this thin 3mm ply, which is what this is. As the laser heats up the material, as the material gets thinner and heats up, this is what happens. You get these little flanges that pop up, they catch on the laser, and I have completely ruined so many jobs doing tests with these lasers, doing projects with these lasers, because as soon as the laser gets thrown off, it's really hard to realign everything and start it again, especially if you're doing stuff that it's really important that it's precision math. It's such a pain. I keep pointing out the depth of that laser head away from the wood, because in all of the projects that I have tested throughout this, I made some of these ornaments as well for my nieces and nephews to decorate for Christmas. I have not had a single project get ruined because of that issue, and that was one of the bigger issues I've had with the laser. That alone has made this such a frustration-free device. Obviously, I know a lot of people are going to have tested these with doing that. Now, if you watch the channel, one of the first projects I tried to make on one of these diode lasers, this is a CO2 on a diode laser, was this clock. Now, you're going to be able to cut out stuff on diode lasers just like you are CO2 lasers. The CO2 laser is just much faster. The problem with this project was I was new to light burn, and the bed I had for it wasn't really big enough, so I tried to scale up the project. It got thrown off a little bit. It took me days to cut everything out, get it all aligned on that little diode laser, that once it didn't work, I just kind of scrapped it. This laser, after doing those test cuts, I think was the laser to try this project out on again. It's a lot of pieces. I already had the file on my computer. I did not make this file. I'll try and remember to put links to all the stuff, give people credit in my description. Sometimes I do forget to do that, so if I do, feel free to remind me. Basically what I'm doing is I already did some test cuts. I knew my settings, and what I'm going to do is I'm using two colors. The stuff I'm cutting is in the frame. The stuff I'm not culling, I make a different color. I turn it off so the laser doesn't recognize it. I could cut out these pieces. As I cut them, I delete them, and then I could use the camera to align and really utilize all of that wood and cut out all of these pieces. Now, like I said, with the diode laser, I believe at the time I was doing a 10 watt. It took me days to cut out all this material. I had multiple miscuts. It was a super frustrating project. With this one, I had all of this cut out with no issues. In an afternoon, a couple hours, I had all of it. Once you see all the parts, you'll see it was quite a lot. Like all the lasers I've tested, because this lumber is an organic material, different manufacturers use different type of materials for the ply, so it's going to be, some materials will be denser than others, and because this stuff does move, because I showed you how much some of this stuff moves, even the thicker material, as the material changes, it's going to adjust the focus of the laser. So across the board, any laser I've tested, I've had this issue where you can get something set up and it won't fully cut through. The goal is to get it to cut through enough, so like you saw, I was just using a little bit of a utility knife to finish it up. The other nice thing about these lasers, as you can see, is I can work on making drawer boxes in the shop while this is spending 30 minutes cutting out a file. So once again, this is all parts of those clock. This part is the 3mm basswood. The other material, the clock dimensions are supposed to be for 6mm ply, but that's a little bit hard to source, and I've noticed that as these lasers get more popular, it used to be really easy to go buy like a hobbyist pack of ply on Amazon, really inexpensive. Now they've gotten pretty expensive. So the main issue I had with this clock the first time around was the pallets I made just wouldn't, they weren't timed right, they weren't sized right, it wouldn't work. You could see with the new file, this is where I messed up. So the improper size one is on top and the proper size one is on bottom. I assembled that whole clock and it still didn't work, which I was not surprised about, but I just kind of put it aside, and I remembered that they had shipped a Rotary with this, and I figured I'd test that out and come back to the clock. It's the easiest way to keep things in one piece in my shop. So I'm very honest in these videos. I really have no interest in a Rotary. I might engrave some stuff on a wine glass for someone as a present one of these days, but I don't really use them except for these review videos. So I'm going to go through this very quickly. If you're someone that's into rotaries, the setup they ship me with this machine isn't terrible, but I prefer the chuck setup, and I believe they do make those for this machine. Getting everything set up wasn't hard. There's a switch in the back of the machine, a cable that plugs right into the back of the machine. If you've been watching all these videos I've been doing for probably 2 years now, setting up these rotors used to be such a pain. You had to go change all sorts of files and do all sorts of stuff. This one, you're basically flipping a switch, setting up light burn for it, calculating their circumference like you would everything else, and setting it up. Now, they sent me 2 sizes of these, one for smaller objects, bigger objects. You could see the first one I had set up where the container was sitting on the rollers nicely would hit the belts in the back. So I had to use the wider setup, and you could see it was skipping on the wheels and it wasn't tracking well. So I had a miscut on that one. I added a little bit of traction in the form of blue tape, and the engraving came out pretty good. Now obviously I would dial in those settings if I was doing that for real, but once again, like the initial test of my logo, you can see that it wasn't elongated, it wasn't squashed, so it was cutting well. So that is basically all I'm going to cover with the rotary. It plugs in, it works. If you want to do thicker pieces, I've read about people elevating their machine. I used to do that with other lasers, so I think that's how you get thicker pieces. And then I had made a few changes to this. I think one of the reasons I was having issues with it, once again, is I'm just not using the right thickness ply. But I also knew what a pain this was the first time around, and I figured I'd cut it real fast. If I could get it to work, I'd spend the money on the nicer ply and cut it again. So this is what it looks like all set up. Basically, I got the pendulum in there, and I'm not going to lie, I was absolutely shocked that this started ticking. Unfortunately, with the voiceover, you're not going to hear the awesome sound it makes. Once the escape wheel started turning, I was super excited. I couldn't even get the last one to move even once. It just completely didn't function, and it was weeks of troubleshooting it to try and get it to work, and it just didn't. So I was pretty excited about that. You can see the hour hand and the minute hand, all those gears mesh and work nicely. The problem with this is I got it running for about 5 minutes and then, or a couple minutes, and then it stops. And that's just because, like I said, with something like this, it's really important to stick to the dimensions. The plywood I cut all this out of was a heavy 3/16 of an inch. You saw in the measurements. It wasn't exactly 6 millimeters, so I had to shim stuff, because when you cut stuff to the holes dimensions, the parts that connect are a little too thin. So if you're buying patterns online, just really make sure, like I didn't have an option with this one because there wasn't a lot of clock plans available when I bought this, but just keep that in mind. And then one thing I wanted to point out before I wrap up this video is, if you watch the channel, you saw I tried to make a Connect 4 the other week, and I was using 1/4-inch ply. I was able to cut through cordboard. The 1/4-inch ply, I did a bunch of tests, I got it to work, and then when I went to go do it, it did not cut all the way through, and this was basically scrap because I thought it did. And even with the camera, when you're moving a big job like this, it could be a little hard to realign the entire thing. I was able to perfectly cut it out of this 3 millimeter ply. I've had no issues with that stuff whatsoever. After that, I cleaned the mirrors because I had cut so much of the clock stuff a few days before, and I did a couple tests on 2 species of 1/4-inch ply, maple and red oak, and then once again on the 3/16-inch ply, and everything went through. I was reading the upkeep of these CO2 lasers is a little bit more extensive because you have to clean the mirrors. But going forward, there's some components of this I didn't test. Technically, it has a pass-through on it as well, which I want to try out. And I do want to dial in those 1/4-inch. So going forward, this is going to be my primary driver in the shop. The fact that I had no miscuts or laser catches on this would be enough to put it into that category anyways. I tried to fit as much information in here as possible. There's a lot to cover with these lasers, and even though I've tested so many, honestly, especially since this is a CO2 versus a diode, there's just always a learning curve with every single one. But I do plan on showcasing this more on the channel as I make more projects with the lasers. I'll keep people updated on how it's working.